The NFC South might just be the worst division in the NFL. However, there is a couple of really good teams in this division with at least one potential contender and a couple of mediocre teams. So in today's video, let's talk about the NFC South and give you guys my NFC South preview. Hey guys, again, we'll be talking about the NFC South here. It's not a very good division, but I do think there's some pretty fun storylines going on with this division, whether it's Bryce Young in year 2, Atlanta getting Kirk Cousins, or the mediocrity of the Saints. I do still think this division is going to be a lot of fun to talk about. So in today's video, we're going to be breaking down each individual team for about 2 to 3 minutes for each team. And then at the very end of the video, I'll give you guys my full division preview with some sort of predictions as to how the division will go. Now, before I actually get into the video, around 93% of you guys who are watching this video are not subscribed to the YouTube channel. That's a massive number. So if you guys enjoy the content, if you guys like me, if you guys love me, hit the like and subscribe button. But let's hop into the video. So as I mentioned, we are going to be talking about each individual team first, and we are going to start off with the Atlanta Falcons. Maybe the best team in this division, and arguably the only team in this division that I think is a somewhat genuine contender. Now, last year, the Atlanta Falcons came in 3rd place of the division with a 7-10 record and kind of had a bizarre year that kind of has followed suit with the past couple years. But this offseason, they had a bunch of massive changes, starting off with the quarterback room. This was a quarterback room with last year being held by guys like Taylor Heineke and Desmond Ridder. Now you have some new guys in here like Michael Penix Jr. and Kirk Cousins, who I think are going to be pretty good quarterbacks for this team in the future. Not to mention, you fired Arthur Smith and hired a new head coach who I'm very excited about. And then you expect some progression from guys like Bijan Robinson, Drake London, Darnell Mooney, and Kyle Pitts. And defensively speaking, while it wasn't the greatest draft in terms of what they could have done defensively, they still brought in some nice talented players like Rook Ororo or Braylon Trice. I think there is some young talent there that I'm quite excited to see what they can do in year number 1. Let's go ahead and start off by talking about the Michael Penix Jr. pick, because that's sort of been maybe the biggest story of the offseason for the Atlanta Falcons. And I'm going to just be very bluntly honest. I didn't love the pick for the Atlanta Falcons because I just didn't think it made a bunch of sense, both short term and in some ways long term. And let me give you guys a quick little rundown as to why. I made a full video on it, so you guys can check my page if you want to see a bigger explanation as to why I don't love it. But I just don't love it because you just signed Kirk Cousins to a massive deal, and you're just going to have Michael Penix Jr., who's already an older quarterback, sitting on your bench for a couple years before he ever hits the actual field. I know that Kirk has a bit of an injury history, most recently with the Achilles injury, and maybe that's the thought process for the Falcons. But I feel as if Taylor Heineke is a good enough quarterback that you're okay with starting him if Kirk Cousins is to miss a game or two. Not to mention, you still could have gotten a younger, talented quarterback in like the 2nd round if you really wanted to. With that being said, I still do like Michael Penix Jr., and I think he was one of the better quarterbacks in this year's draft, so I don't think it's that bad of a move. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. Sorry for the spill there. Let's actually talk about the Falcons because they're a pretty loaded roster. I like a lot of pieces on this team. I think the offensive line is fantastic. I think Bijan Robinson should be in for a offensive player of the year like season. I made a video a couple months ago or a couple weeks ago, and I talked about some of my hot takes for 2024, and I said in the video that I think Bijan Robinson will be the offensive player of the year, and I'm going to stand 10 toes down on that one. I think Bijan has the potential to be the best running back in the league next year, even higher than a guy like Christian McCaffrey. I think he has that much potential, but I do think they actually need to actually find ways to get him the ball, not just with running it, but throwing it to him and just having him do a bunch of crazy plays, because he's a freak of talent with so much potential to be a fantastic player. Next year, I want to see guys like Drake London and Kyle Pitts be officially unlocked. These are two guys with so much potential, and I actually want to see it on the football field for once. So with all that being said, we talked about the Atlanta Falcons. I predict that they'll probably win somewhere between 10 to 13 games next year. Now, this does completely depend on the overall health of Kirk Cousins. I think if Kirk Cousins stays healthy the entire season, this will be a pretty good team. I just don't really know if they're full-on championship contenders quite yet. But hypothetically speaking, if Kirk goes out there and plays fantastic, maybe they are a contender. Next up at number 2, let's discuss the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They're one of the few teams that I have not really talked about in much detail in this offseason. And it's kind of a bad move on my part, but just to be honest with you guys, I'm just not a big fan of what Tampa Bay has currently been doing. Last year, Tampa Bay did win the division. They went 9-8 and made it to the 2nd round of the playoffs and actually had some pretty fun games against the Eagles and the Lions. And this offseason, they basically brought back the majority of the roster. They gave a big contract to Baker Mayfield, 3 years, around $100 million. They brought in a guy like Graham Burton, changed some pieces defensively, and just for the most part kind of stayed the same, which I don't know if is a good thing or a bad thing. They're one of the few teams in the NFL where it's like, I like their roster, I just don't know what they could realistically do to get themselves to that next level. But I kind of have a theory on what the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are doing, because they got to be honest with themselves. They know that Baker Mayfield is not going to lead them to a Super Bowl. I think it's part of the reason they only gave him a 3-year deal. I think realistically speaking, they know they don't have a quarterback on the roster that can lead them to a championship. And so in some ways, I kind of think that Baker Mayfield is like the definition of what is going to be a bridge quarterback. They have this championship level roster that maybe isn't championship ready right now, but does have a lot of really good pieces on it. So my theory is that for the next couple years, they're just going to continue to acquire more talent and just probably be somewhat mediocre or maybe a little bit competitive. And then maybe 2 to 3 years down the line, when somebody like, who knows, Dak Prescott, Justin Herbert, Trevor Lawrence, one of those guys asks out of their roster and maybe comes to a team like Tampa Bay, then they could basically go all in on that quarterback and build all in on building a roster for that quarterback to walk into and lead them to a championship instantly. I don't really know if that's the greatest strategy in the world, because I think you're going to need a lot of things to go your way. But if it does work out, then I am willing to at least hear them out on this one. As for what I think they're going to do next year, I think they're going to be kind of similar to what they were. They're going to be division contenders. I don't think they're going to make it. I don't think they're going to make it past the second round again if they were to make the playoffs. I think they're going to win somewhere between 7 to 11 games next year. And again, I kind of think they're just going to be pretty similar to what they were last year. A competitive team, but not a great team. Next up at number 3, we have the Carolina Panthers, probably the team that I will be watching the most in 2024. I don't think it's an understatement to say that last year, going 2-15 and being 4th in your division was not an embarrassment of a season, because it was the definition of an embarrassment. For context, they were negative 180 net point differential, which is their points for minus their points against. They scored 236 points and they gave up 416. 236 was, I think, the lowest in the NFL. And I just double checked it. It was tied first with the New England Patriots, which you do not want to be tied with the New England Patriots because they were horrific last year. And 416 points was just ridiculous for this defense, because I do think the defense is pretty talented. I just feel as if they were put into a really rough spot last year with how bad the offense was. So this offseason, they made it a focal point to fix everything that was wrong with this offense. They brought in a new offensive mind in Dave Canales, who is kind of known to be a quarterback fixer. He fixed Geno Smith. He somewhat fixed Baker Mayfield. And while I don't think you have to necessarily quote unquote fix Bryce Young, I think you at least have to fix the system around him to make him a better quarterback. Year 1 of Bryce Young was ugly, man, but I think a lot of the flaws of that team were not necessarily on Bryce Young. I don't think it was his fault that his best receiver was 68-year-old Adam Thielen, and who else was out there? Terrace Marshall, Jonathan Mingo, those guys suck. His starting tight end was Tommy Tremble, who is okay, I guess. And the offensive line couldn't block me if I was out there. It was such a bad unit last year. And it also did not help that they had the worst offensive minds running the team. So this offseason, they brought in a number of new players, such as Jonathan Brooks from Texas, Xavier Legette, Jatavion Sanders, Damian Lewis, and Robert Hunt. I fully do expect this offense to be much better next year. I don't project this offense to take a drastic step forward. Like, I don't think it's going to be a top 15 offense, but I think it's going to be better than arguably the worst in the league. And I think because of that, I think the defense will be good enough to be at least about average like they were at certain points last year and years beyond. So I think prediction-wise, it's kind of hard to predict what Carolina is going to be, because there's a lot of young players and a lot of unproven players and a lot of just unproven things about this roster. But I do think they took a step forward this offseason. I think it's very hard to imagine that this Panthers team is somehow going to be worse next year than they were last year, because I think last year was about as bad as it could physically get. And I do think this team has enough talent, and I do personally believe in Bryce Young, so I think this team will be better next year, but not by much. I think this team will win somewhere between 4 to 6 games next year, which is going to be kind of step number 2 into heading in the right direction. Last year, you can consider their full-on tank season. Next year, they'll be slightly better, and then hopefully in year 3 or 4 of Bryce Young, this team is trying to contend for the playoffs. And lastly, let's talk about the New Orleans Saints, probably the weirdest team in the NFL, because there's some good things about this team. I think they have a decent coaching staff outside of the head coach, and I think the roster in general is okay. but I kind of just view it as a roster that is super mediocre. Like, they're going to be good next year, but not great, and they're probably going to make the playoffs or come really close to making it, and if they do make the playoffs, they'll probably win like one playoff game at best, but they're not going to make a deep run. And unlike Tampa Bay, which I actually kind of see a theory as to what they're potentially doing with the bridge quarterback situation, I don't really know what the Saints are doing, to be honest with you, because you have guys like Derek Carr who are on massive contracts. You had this whole situation with Ryan Ramczyk now having potentially going to be out for the season. You have Alvin Kamara who's on a big deal. You got a bunch of win now players, but your team is not in a situation to realistically win now. And while I think this team has a number of really talented young players like Talicia Fawanga, Chris Olave, and some pieces defensively, I also just don't think this team is that good. Like, on paper, this is a team that maybe should be somewhere between 10 to 11 games next year, but they're just so inconsistent and it's just really hard to predict what they're actually going to do. I made a video on the Saints going into much more detail. Again, if you want to see that video, just check down later into my page after the video, of course. But I just have a hard time really predicting this Saints team in general because they're either going to be like a 7-win team or like a 12 and 13 win team. Because I could realistically see a world where this team is actually pretty good next year. But even if they are good next year, is it going to lead to any sort of postseason success? Probably not. But I can also see the flip side of that, where this team is absolutely garbage next year and everything just implodes and they fire their coach mid-season and there's all these like speculations about what's going to happen with the quarterback. So to sort of save face here, I'm just going to say they're going to win somewhere between 7 to 11 games next year. I think they'll be pretty impressive against a couple teams and then look like absolute dog shit versus other teams. They're just such a weird team. All right, so I'm starting to lose my voice. We talked about every single team. Let's now give you guys a bit of a preview about the general division. Who do I think is the favorite and who do I think is the least favorite? I think the favorite is the Falcons. I think they are most likely going to win the division next year. Just way too much talent for this team to not win the division for the first time. It's a good team. I like Kirk Cousins. I love Bijan. I think the defense is good enough. I think they're going to be a pretty fun team to watch next year. Probably like 10 wins or so next year. And then in second, I think it's a coin toss between Tampa Bay and the New Orleans Saints. I really just don't know what to tell you guys about those two teams. They're just kind of mediocre teams that are stuck in the middle with questions in the quarterback room, questions with the head coach, questions about a lot of pieces. But I do feel as if both teams have the makeup of two competent rosters that could be pretty competitive with basically every team out there. Those two teams are two teams that could potentially make the playoffs and maybe win a playoff game or two, but aren't going to win a championship or not going to be, and they're not also going to be bad enough to have like a top 10 pick. So they're really confusing. And then you have Carolina, which I think it's pretty realistic to say that they will again be the worst team in the division, but I think they will take a step forward next year. Again, I think they'll win somewhere like 4 to 6 games next year, which is a second step forward into making this team at least a competent roster 3 to 4 years into Bryce Young's career. And so in my last video, we talked about the NFC North. So if you guys maybe want to hear about that division, check out that video. NFC North is actually a good division, unlike this one. And if you enjoyed today's video, hit the like and subscribe button. I would really appreciate it. And I love you guys. Peace.